When I was a small child, my grandfather made for me a little attaché case. It was wooden, it had a nice little handle, it had a lock, and it had what I assumed was my name stenciled on the top. I was very proud of it, and I kept all my treasures in it. One day, when I was telling my granddad how pleased I was with my little case, I happened to say, "But Grandad, you have put J-E-A-H on the top, and you spelled Jean J-E-A-N. My grandfather explained to me carefully he hadn't put my name on the top at all. The letters J-E-A-H were my initials. Jean, Evelyn, Amy, Hawkins. I had never realised that. The Jean was because I wasn't John. My grandmother, assured that I would be a boy, had knitted me garments and had embroidered them J. J for John, because John Hawkins was a knight. In the event, I was a girl, so I was Jean, which was good, because by then it had also worked out that John Hawkins was a pirate. The E was for my mum, Evelyn. She liked being Evelyn. She didn't mind being Eve. She couldn't bear it if anyone said Eva. And the A was for my grandmother, Amy. It was the name that I liked least as a young girl. Now it's probably the name that of the three names is the one that's the most popular. I tell you that because I'm moving on from talking about my mother to talk about my grandmother and my father's mother, my other grandmother, always referred to by me as Nan and Grandma. The two ladies were physically quite alike, big women. They were, in every other respect, very, very different. My mother's mother was a Cockney, through and through. She really did snuff, and she really did have a parrot who she insisted was the one who had taught her swear words because the parrot had been in the Navy. She was an excellent cook, but my recollection of her is that she sat in the corner of the living room and she wore her overall. The sort of overall where you put both arms in and the front sort of overlaps with a tie bit that goes through and round the back and then ties at the front. It seems to me that she always wore an overall, and that every year at Christmas she would have 3 new ones. I don't know who brought them for her. It's possible she brought them for herself. 1 on, 1 in the wash, and 1 to spare. The only occasions when I ever remember her still sitting in that chair, but without the overall, was on Christmas afternoon, not in the morning, you understand, because she always cooks Christmas lunch, and on a significant birthday and a significant anniversary. Her cooking became, in a way, my cooking. She always could make a meal that tasted splendid. And when you consider that she cooked all the way through the wartime, and I would watch her cook or help her cook. And I could remember saying one day when she was showing me how to make bread pudding, not summer pudding, bread pudding that's like a cake. "Do you put an egg in it, Grandma?" And she would say, "No, dear, unless you've got one." And then I would say, "And does it have currants, Nan?" And she would say, "If you could spare some." She also had the cleanest kitchen floor, I suspect, in Christendom. Why? Because in her quite big kitchen there was a big built-in boiler. And every Monday, all the washing would get piled into this boiler and boiled, literally. And when it boiled, it inevitably boiled over. For many years, I would go to my Nan's house for lunch from school, and I can remember every Monday coming in the back door and having to tread very carefully over the sudsy water that always covered the kitchen floor. That meant on Monday we always had cold meat, and you could tell which day of the week it was by what the menu was. And every Christmas we would have rabbit. People don't eat rabbit very much these days, but my recollections of rabbit are fond and festive. All through the year there would be a rabbit in a hutch in my grandma's garden, and I would say, "Nan A, can I feed the rabbit? Nan A, can I pet the rabbit?" I don't think I was very bright in some respects, because it never seemed to occur to me that after Christmas the rabbit was always different to the one that had been there before Christmas. Until one year, just before the holiday, I opened the door of the walk-in larder, and there, hanging on the back of the door, with wooden staves holding it open, was the rabbit that I had been feeding and petting all year. It was being hung. That's a term for dealing with things like game. I had another clue as well that year. When we opened our presents, my present was a beautiful pair of fur mittens. I think I wept a little when I realised that for all of the years I had been eating at Christmas the rabbit that I had been petting all year. But when the next Christmas came, which was a few days later, I still tucked in to my Christmas meal. My grandmother always was full of stories about when she was a girl in service. And she would tell me stories about the early morning bells, the bell to get up, the bell to be ready for your breakfast, and the bell to be ready for the bell. What can that mean, I hear you ask? Well, she lived in a great big house, and one of the things in great big houses was that sometimes there would be lots of guests, and the first bell was to warn the guests to get back into their own beds. Fun. My other grandma, quite different. A pillar of society. She taught the piano, and she lived in Rochester. If you looked at the map, you would have some doubt as to whether she lived in Rochester or Chatham. I think she lived on the line between the two. But because my grandmother had some illusions of grandeur, she, of course, as I previously explained, lived in Rochester. I think that my mum was a little bit afraid of my grandmother, that I always called Grandma. She would arrive at our house like a galleon in full sail, and she would remove her hat and the hat pin, and for some years I was sure that when she put the hat and the pin back on, the pin went right through her head. One of my favourite stories of her was the day that my brother had been tadpoling, and on the windowsill of the lavatory, which wasn't quite up the garden, it was opposite the back door, he had put a jar with some pretty grimy pond water and lots of tadpoles. Grandma came to visit and needed to use the facilities. After a little while, there were dreadful cries of distress and noises off, and myself, my brother and my mother rushed to see what the problem was. The door of the lavatory was open, there was smashed glass on the floor, greeny brackish water all over the place, and innumerable tadpoles around various bits of the windowsill, the floor, and my grandmother's ample bosom. My mother flapped around a bit inconsequentially, trying to get the water and the tadpoles off my gran, and I decided that I ought to try and look as though I was useful, but I didn't know what to do, and my brother sort of retreated, until my grandma said, "Eve, stop messing around. My blouse will wash. I will wash. Do not you realize that tadpoles are a protected species?" We had underestimated the woman. She was never to be underestimated. She had in her house a gas stove, and she was very good at making nice cakes. And at that time, North Sea gas emerged, and everyone had to have their gas stoves modified for the new source of gas. And the gas board published that they would do this modification for free for anyone who had a gas stove in working order. 2 unsuspecting young engineers came to my grandma's house, and she gave them tea and cake, which they appreciated. She then took them to show them the gas stove that needed to be modified. The 2 young men blanched somewhat, because the gas stove was homemade, made by my grandfather. Not many people have a homemade gas stove. And when the young men said, "Oh, we can't do anything about that," she got the advertisement from the paper, which was poised and ready. She showed it to them, and she said, pointing to the plate of cakes that they had just eaten, "Was the gas stove in working order?" And they had to admit that it was. "Therefore," she said, "I am entitled to a new one if you will not modify this one." She got her new gas stove. What the ladies had in common was that they were both indomitable. Bye.